No contact won't break them, but this will destroy an avoidance ego. The strange thing nobody warns you about is that avoidance can survive distance far better than most people expect. You block them, disappear, stop texting, remove your attention, and while you're sitting there wondering if they finally feel your absence, they often retreat deeper into themselves instead. Not because they never cared, and not because the relationship meant nothing, but because emotional disconnection is where they feel safest. Silence is familiar territory to them. Detachment is not punishment in their mind, it is protection. That's why so many people become confused after no contact. They expect emotional panic. They expect dramatic messages, emotional confessions, desperate attempts to reconnect, but avoidants are wired differently. The more emotionally overwhelmed they feel, the more they shut down. And the more you chase closure, the more they convince themselves they were right to escape intimacy in the first place. But there is something far more powerful than no contact, something that reaches deeper than distance ever could, something that quietly tears apart the emotional illusion avoidants depend on to feel in control. And the terrifying part for them is that it has nothing to do with revenge. So if you've ever felt discarded by someone emotional unavailable, if you've ever watched someone pull away the moment love became real, stay with me until the end because this will completely change the way you understand avoidant psychology. And while you're here, subscribe if you enjoy brutally honest psychological truths that most people are too afraid to say out loud. Because once you understand this pattern, you stop blaming yourself for the emotional confusion they created. Avoidants survive no contact because distance helps them maintain the story they tell themselves internally. A story that says emotions are dangerous, dependence is weakness, and vulnerability eventually leads to pain. Most avoidants learned long ago that closeness comes with emotional risk. So instead of developing healthy emotional regulation, they developed emotional escape routes. Withdrawal became their survival mechanism, independence became their identity, and over time they trained themselves to associate emotional intensity with loss of control. That's why when someone cuts contact with them, they often don't react immediately. In fact, sometimes they seem completely unaffected, cold, unbothered, even relieved. But what most people fail to understand is that avoidants are experts at suppressing emotion, not processing it. They disconnect from feelings the same way some people hold their breath underwater. It works temporarily, but eventually the pressure builds somewhere beneath the surface. The problem is that many people think the goal is to make the avoidant suffer. So they use silence like a weapon, hoping the avoidant will suddenly wake up emotionally transformed. But silence alone often allows avoidants to avoid accountability entirely. They convince themselves they never needed the relationship anyway. They bury themselves in distractions, routines, work, temporary connections, anything that keeps them from confronting emotional depth. And because avoidants fear emotional dependence, they secretly view their ability to detach as strength. Every time they successfully suppress attachment, their ego reinforces the belief that they are untouchable, that nobody truly has emotional power over them. But that illusion only survives under one condition: you still emotionally orbit around them. This is where everything changes, because the one thing that deeply destabilizes an avoidant is not your absence, it is your emotional independence. The moment you genuinely stop needing their validation, something shifts psychologically inside them, not performatively, not through games, not through fake indifference posted online hoping they notice. Real emotional detachment, real self-reclamation, real healing. That is what quietly destroys the avoidant ego, because avoidants unconsciously rely on emotional asymmetry. They feel safer when they are less emotionally invested than the other person. It gives them psychological leverage, control, distance. But when the person they emotionally withdrew from suddenly becomes grounded, fulfilled, emotionally stable, and no longer desperate for answers, the avoidant loses the dynamic that protected their identity. Suddenly they are forced to confront a reality they never prepared for. You moved forward emotionally without them. And for someone who secretly believed they would always remain emotionally untouchable in your mind, that realization cuts deeper than no contact ever could. Because avoidants often expect people to wait emotionally, even after they leave, even after they become distant. A part of them unconsciously assumes access to you will always remain open. Your love becomes a psychological safety net they think will always exist in the background. So when they sense that your emotional energy has genuinely shifted away from them, not angrily, not bitterly, but peacefully, it creates internal confusion. They start questioning the role they once played in your emotional world. And that uncertainty quietly attacks the ego structure they built around emotional control. What hurts the avoidant ego is not losing attention temporarily. It is realizing they no longer influence your emotional state, because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but they are equally sensitive to emotional irrelevance. The moment they sense they are no longer central to your emotional reality, their internal defenses start cracking in ways they rarely admit openly. Suddenly your silence feels different, your distance feels different. Not because you are trying to manipulate them, but because your energy no longer reaches toward them at all. And that is terrifying for someone who built their emotional safety around keeping intimacy at arm's length. You see, avoidants often mistake emotional suppression for emotional mastery. They think needing nobody means they are powerful, but deep underneath that detachment is usually unresolved shame. Shame about vulnerability, shame about emotional dependence, shame about not knowing how to sustain intimacy without feeling trapped or exposed. That's why emotionally healthy people become unintentionally threatening to avoidants, because healthy love requires presence, consistency, accountability, emotional honesty, and avoidants often feel inadequate in those environments even if they never say it aloud. So when you heal, when you stop chasing emotionally unavailable people, when you stop trying to prove your worth to someone who keeps withdrawing from connection, you unknowingly force the avoidant to face the one thing they spend their entire life escaping, themselves. And the hardest truth of all is that avoidants often do not fully feel the emotional weight of losing someone until that person has emotionally moved on for real. Not when you're crying, not when you're begging for clarity, not when you're sending paragraphs trying to save the connection. During those moments, the avoidant is usually overwhelmed and retreating deeper into emotional shutdown. But later, when the emotional noise disappears completely, when your energy no longer reaches for them, when they realize you are no longer emotionally available to control, predict, or return to whenever loneliness hits, that is when the reality finally begins to surface. Because now they are no longer escaping a relationship, they are confronting absence, and absence feels very different when the other person is genuinely gone emotionally. That is the moment the avoidant ego begins to crack, not through punishment, not through revenge, but through the painful realization that someone they assumed would always care finally stopped revolving around them entirely. That realization becomes even more painful for the avoidant when they begin noticing that your life did not collapse without them. In fact, sometimes it begins expanding in ways they never expected. And this is where avoidants experience a kind of emotional disorientation they rarely understand themselves, because while they spent so much time maintaining distance to avoid feeling trapped, they also quietly depended on knowing they still mattered deeply to you. Your emotional attachment reassured them even when they acted detached. It fed a silent sense of significance, not always maliciously, not always consciously, but many avoidants feel safest when they can leave emotional doors half open behind them. They disappear, return, pull away, reconnect, create confusion, then retreat again. And every time the other person remains emotionally available despite the inconsistency, the avoidant unconsciously confirms a belief: no matter how distant I become, I still have emotional access here. But the moment that access disappears for real, something inside them starts unraveling, because now they are confronted with emotional consequences they can no longer control through withdrawal. Your growth becomes evidence that they were not as emotionally untouchable as they believed. And strangely enough, avoidants often do not react to this loss with direct vulnerability. They react through subtle behaviors, sudden curiosity, random check-ins, watching from a distance, small attempts to re-enter your emotional atmosphere without fully admitting they miss you. Because the avoidant ego does not like direct emotional exposure. It prefers indirect testing. They want reassurance without surrendering emotional control. They want to know if the connection still exists without fully risking rejection themselves. This is why people become confused when avoidants suddenly resurface after long periods of silence. It feels contradictory, sometimes even manipulative, but psychologically the avoidant is often responding to a disruption in emotional certainty. Your healing changed the emotional equation. Before, they knew where you stood. They knew your emotional energy still leaned toward them. Even your pain reassured them of their importance. But once you emotionally detach in a healthy and authentic way, the avoidant can no longer predict their place in your inner world. And unpredictability deeply unsettles avoidants because they are used to managing intimacy through emotional distance. The second they lose that map, anxiety quietly enters the picture. Not necessarily anxiety about losing the relationship itself, but anxiety about losing emotional control over the narrative they created. Suddenly they begin wondering questions they once avoided completely. What if you actually stop caring? What if someone else reaches parts of you they never could? What if the emotional safety net they relied on no longer exists? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, what if you realized your worth without needing their validation first? That question alone threatens the avoidant ego at its core because avoidants often maintain emotional distance by unconsciously believing intimacy gives others too much power over them. But when you stop seeking emotional approval from them, the power dynamic reverses in a way they never expected. Now they are the ones sitting with uncertainty. Now they are the ones wondering where they stand. Now they are the ones facing emotional ambiguity without the comfort of guaranteed access to you. And what makes this even more psychologically intense is that avoidants are not emotionless people. That is one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding them. Avoidants often feel deeply, sometimes painfully deeply. But instead of expressing emotions openly, they compartmentalize them until the feelings become buried under layers of rationalization and emotional suppression. They convince themselves they are fine, they distract themselves with independence, they intellectualize emotions instead of processing them, but suppressed emotions do not disappear. They linger beneath the surface and emerge in strange ways. Restlessness, emotional numbness, chronic dissatisfaction, sudden nostalgia, unexplained loneliness, or an inability to fully connect with new people. Because despite what avoidants project outwardly, emotional attachment still leaves imprints on them, especially when the connection felt safe, genuine, and emotionally intimate. The difference is that avoidants often process grief in reverse. While the other person feels the devastation immediately after separation, the avoidant may initially feel relief from emotional pressure, but as time passes and reality settles in, the emotional weight they avoided begins slowly surfacing, not dramatically, quietly, late at night, during moments of solitude, in the spaces where distraction no longer works. And that delayed emotional processing can become extremely destabilizing once they realize the person they emotionally distance themselves from has genuinely evolved without them. This is also why emotional maturity becomes the one thing avoidants struggle to defend themselves against. Arguments do not shake them the way calm detachment does. Emotional chaos reinforces their need to escape, but emotional groundedness forces them to confront their own patterns without having someone else to blame. When you stop reacting impulsively, stop trying to force emotional closeness, stop collapsing every time they withdraw, the avoidant loses the familiar relationship dynamic they depended on. Suddenly there is no emotional chase, no desperation, no pressure they can point to as justification for their distance, only your quiet self-respect. And self-respect is deeply confronting for avoidants because it reflects the emotional stability they often struggle to maintain internally. Healthy detachment says, I care deeply, but I will not abandon myself to keep someone emotionally comfortable. And for avoidance, that kind of energy is difficult to manipulate, difficult to predict, and impossible to control through withdrawal. Because emotionally healthy people do not beg for scraps of connection. They do not chase mixed signals forever. They do not keep shrinking themselves to fit inside someone else's emotional limitations. And when avoidants encounter someone who finally understands this, they often experience a kind of internal collision between admiration and fear. Admiration because they secretly respect emotional strength. Fear because genuine intimacy now requires accountability instead of distance. Eventually, many avoidants reach a moment they never anticipated, a moment where they realize the person they once kept at arm's length is no longer emotionally waiting for them at all. And that realization carries a unique kind of grief. Not just the grief of losing someone, but the grief of recognizing what their own avoidance cost them. Because deep down, many avoidants are painfully aware of the love they failed to fully receive while they had the chance. They remember the patience, the understanding, the emotional safety they were offered. But by the time they begin understanding the value of what they lost, the connection often no longer belongs to them emotionally. And that is where the avoidant ego breaks most deeply. Not when someone tries to hurt them, not when someone plays games, but when someone finally stops revolving around their emotional inconsistency and chooses peace instead, because nothing forces avoidants to confront themselves more than seeing someone they once emotionally controlled become emotionally free. What makes this even more tragic is that avoidants often do not realize they are creating these losses in real time. From the outside, it can look cold, calculated, even cruel. But internally, many avoidants are trapped inside a constant conflict between craving connection and fearing what connection demands from them. They want intimacy until intimacy starts becoming emotionally real. They want love until love requires consistency. They want closeness until someone begins depending on them emotionally, and the moment the relationship reaches that deeper layer where vulnerability can no longer be avoided, something inside them panics. Suddenly they feel pressured, overwhelmed, emotionally exposed. Not because the other person necessarily did anything wrong, but because true intimacy activates unresolved fears they spent years trying to outrun. This is why avoidants often sabotage relationships during the exact moments they should be deepening emotionally. The closer the connection becomes, the louder their internal alarm system grows, and instead of communicating that fear openly, they create distance. They become inconsistent, harder to read, emotionally unavailable. They start convincing themselves something is missing, something feels off, something doesn't feel right anymore. But many times, what they are actually feeling is the discomfort of emotional vulnerability itself. And because avoidants rarely learned how to sit safely inside emotional discomfort, they escape it before they can understand it. The painful irony is that many avoidants deeply admire emotionally secure people while simultaneously fearing them, because emotionally secure people cannot be controlled through emotional withdrawal. They do not collapse every time affection disappears temporarily. They notice inconsistency. They feel the distance. But instead of abandoning themselves trying to fix the connection alone, they slowly begin redirecting emotional energy back toward themselves. And this creates a terrifying experience for avoidants, because secure people unintentionally expose emotional patterns that avoidants usually keep hidden beneath charm, independence, or emotional detachment. The avoidant suddenly realizes their usual coping mechanisms are no longer producing the same emotional power. Silence no longer creates panic. Withdrawal no longer guarantees pursuit. Mixed signals no longer create endless emotional waiting. And when avoidants lose access to those dynamics, they are forced into unfamiliar emotional territory where they must either become emotionally honest or risk losing the connection entirely. That is why emotionally secure detachment feels so powerful. It is not aggressive, it is not vindictive. It simply refuses to participate in emotional instability anymore. And for avoidants, that can feel deeply unsettling because their identity often depends on controlling intimacy through distance. Once that control stops working, the emotional walls they built begin losing their purpose. Many avoidants secretly carry a fear they almost never verbalize openly, the fear that if someone truly sees them emotionally, they may not be enough. Underneath the independence, underneath the self-protection, underneath the emotional withdrawal, there is often unresolved shame tied to vulnerability itself. Shame about emotional needs, shame about attachment, shame about not knowing how to sustain closeness without eventually sabotaging it. This is why avoidants sometimes appear emotionally confident while internally struggling with profound insecurity. Their distance becomes armor, their detachment becomes identity. Their emotional unavailability becomes the very thing protecting them from confronting deeper wounds they do not know how to heal. But eventually, life creates moments where avoidance stops working completely, moments where loneliness grows louder than distraction, moments where emotional independence no longer feels empowering, only isolating. And during those moments, many avoidants begin remembering the people who offered them genuine emotional safety before fear convinced them to run from it. Not because avoidants forget love easily, but because they often recognize the value of emotional intimacy too late, after their defensive patterns already pushed it away. And perhaps this is the part nobody talks about enough. Avoidants are often haunted more by emotional regret than emotional rejection. Rejection confirms the story they already expect, that closeness leads to pain. But regret is different. Regret forces them to confront their own role in losing something meaningful. It forces them to acknowledge that the person who loved them was not necessarily trying to trap them, control them, or suffocate them. Sometimes that person was simply trying to connect. And once avoidants begin recognizing that distinction, the emotional weight becomes much harder to escape psychologically, because now they can no longer fully blame the relationship itself for why things fell apart. They begin seeing their own emotional withdrawal more clearly. The moments they shut down instead of communicating, the moments they disappeared instead of staying emotionally present, the moments they withheld vulnerability because fear convinced them distance was safer than honesty. And this self-awareness can become deeply painful because avoidants often realize they did care far more than they allowed themselves to express. But by the time they understand the depth of their own feelings, the other person has usually exhausted themselves emotionally trying to hold the relationship together alone. This is why the ultimate shift in power happens quietly, not dramatically. It happens when you stop trying to prove your worth to someone emotionally unavailable and begin recognizing that love should not require abandoning your own emotional needs. It happens when you finally understand that healing is not about making the avoidant regret losing you. It is about no longer needing their recognition in order to feel valuable. And strangely enough, that is the exact moment avoidants often feel the loss most intensely. Because now your energy feels different. There is no emotional desperation left to hold on to. No invisible tether keeping the connection emotionally suspended in place. Only acceptance, only closure. Only the quiet realization that you are no longer emotionally trapped inside the cycle they created.